I'm happy to be here tonight for the Genealogy Society. As I tell people, I'm a fourth generation Frogvillian on one side of the family and a fifth generation on the other side. So I have a deep knowledge of families and history in Frogville. And so I'm happy to talk to you about that tonight. And what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about research and resources and some of the statistical information. And then I'm going to talk to you about the down and dirty about some of the families, because I figured that's what you're actually more interested in. But I grew up in Frogville, hence the fourth generation, fifth generation. And I went to high school at Fort Towson, went to college at Southeastern, went to law school at Baylor. I was a debater in college. We didn't have a debate program at Fort Towson, so I learned on the fly once I got to college. And what do you do with an old, used-up debater? You send them to law school because we don't know how to do anything else. So I was an English and speech major, and that worked well for me. And I think some of you know, in my post-retirement phase, which is where I am now, I do speaking, and I gave you all a copy of my speaker magazine. I had to be old before I could be a cover girl, so this is the best I could do. But I write children's stories, and the name comes from Frogville. They are fairy tales, so they are not actually based in Frogville. But they're fun. The main character is a girl, and she turns into a frog when she's 13 and has to go on a series of adventures to get back to being a girl. So they're wholesome and they're fun, and I get to use my training as an English major, which, by the way, qualifies you to go to graduate school. That's about all you can do with that, unless someone dies in an English department somewhere so you can teach. But that's my background. So let's talk a little bit about Frogville. And the first thing I want to talk about is, where is Frogville? Because these days when people talk about Frogville, they talk sort of about coming off of 271 and everything from there until you get back to Highway 70. And that is technically correct as the Frogville general area. However, it's not technically correct. There was actually a Frogville community that was founded in the late 1830s. So the community, if you know where the milk truck is, and everyone knows where the milk truck is, that was downtown central Frogville, and used to be quite a community. It had all of the things that you have for a community. It had a post office, had 2 churches. I don't believe it ever had a bank. The bank was actually in Fort Towson. But that's where the community is, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of the community of Frogville and the information about it. So welcome to my Frogville, which is a little bit different than what you hear. Now, Frogville was founded as part of the Choctaw Nation in Indian Territory. Much of the property in that area was allocated allotment land for Choctaw Indians. And there do not appear to still be any of the families that had their allotted land. There are some Choctaw freedmen families, black slaves that were freed by the tribe, whose families still own their allotments. Freedmen got 40 acres. If you were a full-blood Choctaw, you got 640. If you were half, you got 320, and so on. But if you look at the records for Choctaw County and go to the courthouse, you will see that those allocated lands can be blocked, and you can see who got what and how much land they all received. And I think we have someone else joining us. We're talking about the land allotments in Frogville, because when the Choctaws were given lands after the Dawes Rolls were enacted, much of the property in what is truly Frogville was allocated to various families, and we'll talk about some of those families a little bit later. But the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, which if you own any property in this area and you have an abstract, That's the first item that you see at the front of your abstract, is a reference to Dancing Rabbit Creek. That was the treaty between the United States and the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes when they began their migration in the 1830s from the native lands around Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia into Oklahoma. That first migration was a voluntary one. The later one, of course, was the Andrew Jackson forced migration, which was referred to and is referred to as the Trail of Tears. The fort at Fort Towson was actually the transit point for natives who were coming in off of the Trail of Tears, and they were dispersed into this area. You will also find, if you look at the historical records, that the area in southeastern Oklahoma that was guarded in large part by Camp Maxey, they had a camp there, they had soldiers at Fort Towson, and those were to protect both the native people who had moved in here and what white settlers had moved in here. Now, on my family, on my mother's grandmother's side, they moved into this area from North Carolina, then to Arkansas, and then into this area. And if you look at native speech patterns, you can use linguistics to figure out where people came from. And a lot of the people here actually have roots in Scottish-Irish migration into the East Coast. And they trace through Appalachia and into this area, often identified by people who say "warsh" instead of "wash." That's a dialect that goes back to your Scottish ancestors. So you can trace the migration routes, and many of the families that came here came along that traditional migration. So that's how people got here, and they got here really early. Now, there were settlements, of course, at Dokesville, which many of you are familiar with. There's a settlement at Fort Towson, and then people were settling in Frogville. Frogville itself is located there along the Red River. It's about a mile off of Red River, and the river has been moving. So if you're familiar with our friends Chad Adams and his wife, they lived down in the curve. When I was a kid, you couldn't see the river from the curve. Now, you can actually see the water. So that area has moved over time and continues to do so. The area that was Frogville actually gets a little smaller over time because of subsidence of Red River. Kiamichi County is the way we pronounce it now. The Indians pronounced it a little bit differently. Apparently, from what I can gather, it was Kiamita. And I don't speak Choctaw, so I'm sure I butchered that. But that was the jurisdiction of the tribe that encompassed the area that is actually the Frogville area. Now, the post office was established in 1897, and it was open until 1933. There was a post office, there was a cotton gin. That entire area of what is referred to amongst the locals as the Red River Bottoms, that was cotton country back when cotton was a big crop both here and across the river into North Texas. And big cotton gin, there were a lot of people who lived in that area and worked in the cotton fields, both picking cotton and chopping cotton. My dad said he never actually picked cotton, but he did chop cotton. They hoed cotton. And when he was a kid, you got 25 cents a day for hoeing cotton in the river bottoms, or if you were Wallace Diffie and bought an early truck and picked everybody up that lived in that area and took them across the river to north of Arthur City, I guess. You never remember exactly where it is. It's over close to Paris. They got $1 a day for hoeing cotton there. So that was the sort of work areas that people had during the late 30s and early 40s if they lived in the Frogville area. First church was established there in 1847. Presbyterian Church. I have not been able to locate physically where that church was located, In the early part of the 20th century, there was also a Baptist church that was just north of where the ice cream truck currently sits. And that facility has also been gone for a very long time. But the store building, which the Johnson family still owns, but which was owned and run by the Caldwell family early in the 20th century, was sort of the center of commerce. There was also a junkyard, a mechanic shop, and a small package store across the road from that was run by one of the other families. And that was there into the late 40s, probably gone by the early 50s. But once the post office closed, that really took the center of Frogville out. And so from that point on, it was more of a community than really sort of a village. Because I think it would have been classified as a village rather than a small town during the time that it had all of the sorts of support items that you would expect in a small community. The cemetery is still there. The cemetery that is labeled as the Frogville Cemetery, which is also just north of the ice cream truck, is a black cemetery. It's a historically black cemetery. Probably the most segregated place in all of Frogville is the cemetery. The African American families are buried at the Frogville Cemetery. The white families are buried either at the Shoals Cemetery or at Shote Springs Cemetery, both of which are closer to Hugo, but a lot of the same families that moved in and out. There were families that moved out of the river bottoms because water was an issue. The water was brackish. All of the wells were hand dug, and unless you get really deep there, the water is not high quality. And of course, mosquitoes were a tremendous problem. So my family moved in what they call into the hills, almost a mile further up the road, because they were trying to get away from mosquito infestation and to find better water. Because water, of course, always an issue, as it is currently in this part of the world. Some things never change, but that was a particularly big issue for those families that were new to the area and lived there in the Fort Townsend and Frogville areas. If you look at the geography, and if you look at Wikipedia, which is not really the best source, but it does actually have some interesting information. The U.S. Geological Survey actually has Frogville in its listing. And during the early to mid-60s, the geological group came in and did irrigation. They did, if you go down through there, you'll see that there are big ditches to manage the water. It's always feast or famine there. You're either getting way too much rain and you have to do something to handle it, or you don't have enough rain, which is the problem this fall. But historically, there was a lot of flooding in that area. So the Geological Survey came in and they worked with local landowners to put in drainage ditches, and there are a couple of big retention ponds that were built to handle some of the surface water, making that area much more accessible and much less vulnerable to ongoing flooding. But that area, it has always been a farming area. And like I said earlier, it was a big cotton area. And that ground grew cotton well, but cotton, of course, exhausts all of the nutrients in the soil. So between cotton and corn, when you fast forward into the 70s and 80s, the farmers began to plant soybeans, which puts nutrients back into the soil, and which is actually a better cash crop. But you will see if you go down through there these days, there is less farming and more ranching, because the cost of doing the farming has continued to soar, and the returns on that are not what they used to be. So that's sort of the agricultural background of the Frogville area. Now, in terms of access, of course, 109 has gone down through there for forever. But that road was paved in the 80s. Before that, it was all deep sand, a little bit of gravel, and if you went down through there in the wintertime, you might get to stay for a while because, again, with the water issues before they were controlled, a lot of flooding, a lot of problems with access getting in and out. That has changed, but with all of our visitors who come to go to Ho Chi Town and go zipping down through there, we now have an influx of folks who keep running into fences because they don't realize that there are big curves down through there. So poor Chad Adams has replaced that one part of his fence, I think, a half dozen times since it went up. And all of it due to our friends from Texas who don't realize that GPS forgot to tell them there's a sharp curve. The agriculture economy has really always been the economy for Frogville. As you can imagine, there's not any industry there. In the early part of the 20th century, there was at least one small sawmill. The Hinesley family owned a sawmill facility that was actually close to Goodwater Creek coming out of the river bottoms, headed back up towards Hugo. And the family lived there. They ran the facility. There was a lot more timber there. And as was true in the area around Fort Towson and into McCurtain County, there was a lot of old growth timber. But all of that, of course, is long since gone. There's still timber in the area, but certainly not enough to support any sort of a lumber industry. And it's been a very long time since there's been that. There was peanut growing in the river bottoms, along with the cotton. The Eisenhower agricultural program probably was the death knell for what happened to population in the Frogville area, as is true of many agricultural areas. I did not realize the import of that until I was reading an old article that had interviewed Miss Omi Johnson, who lived down in the river bottoms. And we're going to talk about the Johnson family a little bit more extensively in a bit. But she said that once the Eisenhower agricultural policy really kicked off, you had to have government permission to grow and sell cotton. And you could grow it, but unless you had the magic set of information, you couldn't sell it. So there was no way for people to grow cotton and make money off of it. Same was true for peanuts. You had to have a peanut allotment in order to grow peanuts. And people who had those, because of their financial circumstances, many people sold those. And once you sold that allotment, then you could not grow that crop on that property and make any profit from it. Those policies have largely been eradicated over the last probably 15 to 20 years, but there are still some properties that have the peanut allotment in Frogville. No one's grown a peanut in Frogville as far as I can tell in my entire lifetime, but there are still some properties that have the peanut allotment associated with them. But once the agricultural policy kicked into gear and people were no longer able to grow those crops and make profit off of them, the extended support network that they had, the laborers and the families that were sharecroppers, because there were a significant number of families that didn't own property, but they lived on the property, grew the crop, and then shared the profit at the end of the year with the landowner. And since the landowner could no longer sell those for a profit, nor could the sharecroppers, those families by and large relocated. Some of them went to Arizona, some of them went to California. A number of the African American families moved to Kansas City. I've never understood what the Kansas City connection was, but there are still families who live in the Frogville area whose extended families live in the Kansas City area. And those relocations happened as a result of the Eisenhower agricultural policy in the late 50s and early 60s. Out-migration, as they call it, has been a problem for all of southeastern Oklahoma, and that has to do with lack of industry, of course, and lack of other opportunities. But it really hit hard to communities like Frogville that were primarily dependent on agriculture because there was really nothing to replace those. And once the post office closed, there's no federal support there. And, by the way, there was a school there, and the school closed too. The school building was still there when I was a kid. There had not been a school there in a long time. It is my understanding that, like Swink and some of the other school districts, that was a first grade to 8th grade school. When kids finished the 8th grade, they then transferred elsewhere. The ones in Frogville went to school at Fort Towson. The ones that were a little bit closer to 271, whether they were Golden Bluff or Lone Elm, those kids transferred to Grant because the Grant School District covered that particular area. But those small schools all closed late 40s, early 50s. I tried to do some research to get a specific date for that for this presentation and couldn't find it. I'm sure there are a couple of people still living in Fort Towson who can tell me that, but I haven't been able to get that date. But I do know that my dad attended first grade at Frogville, and the Fort Towson bus drove past their house, and at that point, Choctaw County had a county superintendent in addition to all of the small schools having a superintendent. So my grandmother and the superintendent for the county had a long chat, and Daddy went to school at Fort Towson starting in 2nd grade and thereon, and so did his 2 younger siblings. But the way that the schools worked, that was a small one-room schoolhouse, and just a different kind of educational source. Whether you're in Frogville or elsewhere, the farm numbers statewide will tell you what happened. Because if you look at the statistics, there were 213,325 farmers in Oklahoma in 1935. 1980, 72,000. I didn't find the current number, but I'm sure that number has fallen even further. It is indicative of the change in agriculture and farm support nationwide, but those numbers continue to fall, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. The rural farm population decreased significantly from 1920 to 1950 and has continued to fall. The Eisenhower policy that I was talking about included price supports for some items, but it severely limited who had the ability to use those markets and how they could use them. And price supports, while in some ways sound really good, leave a lot of people behind, and you have to have sort of infrastructure and structural changes that limit who can do what in that sort of an economy. And this is an area that has never had a strong legislative group, so we don't have an advocate and have never had an advocate. And this is the kind of area that really needs an advocate when it comes to policies like this, because without it, what you see is people have no choice but to relocate somewhere in order to make a living and to be successful. The land requirements, of course, decrease the need for those laborers. Those are the people who ended up moving and leaving. I can use another family story for that. My cousins, Gracie and her brother, were born in the Frogville area. They relocated during the Depression. They had to go to California. They actually did well in California. They apparently almost starved on the way out. They told the story about they had 2 vehicles. They had 2 old Model A's, and they were in such poor shape that they wrapped a belt around the tire of one of them. And when they would stop and pick cotton somewhere, and then make enough money to buy gas for the two of them, and they'd drive them as far as they could, and then they would use what they had left to buy gas for one and drag the other. So they managed to get to California. They were by far not the only family that had that sort of experience, but they were people who were displaced by a combination of the Depression and the other issues that were going on in this area. So families that really were dependent on that kind of a lifestyle didn't really have any choice but to head off to greener pastures. Like I said, Gracie and her brother did well after they got there, Gracie and Leroy, but they had a hard time getting there. And their situation was not unusual for people who live in that area, and really people that lived in this area generally, because Oklahoma is and continues to be poor. So for people to have the opportunities that they want, they really have to pick up and move, and this accelerated that. And they not only did the support for that, but now that you have technology, you can GPS your tractor. You don't need farm hands to put out your grain. You can program it into your John Deere tractor, assuming you can afford to buy one or afford to hire them to fix it, because you don't have the right to repair yet. But that decrease in need for help also exacerbated the population issues. I was not able to find any information about scientific studies of what we actually have in terms of soil and soil type and this and that. I was a 4-H land judger in high school, so I learned to dig down in the dirt and figure out what the permeability is, what the soil depth is, and what the type of soil is. Most of the soil in the river bottom area is good, deep, sandy loam. Once you get further up into the hills, whole mile or so up out of the bottoms, it is less loam and a little bit more sand, but that's the general character of the land that's there in the river bottoms. So that area, the reason people were attracted to the Frogville area in the first place was that deep, rich soil, and that continues to be the case. It's just there are fewer people there and fewer people using fewer crops. 5 years ago, there was a bumper corn crop in that area. Chad Adams, the Johnson family, and someone else all planted corn. It was absolutely gorgeous. It would remind you of the song in Oklahoma where the corn is as high as an elephant's eye. Yeah. Absolutely beautiful.
I remember when they had corn out.
Yeah, it was really, really pretty. Problem is, all of the corn is genetically modified, and it costs so much to plant per acre that they have now turned much of that corn farmland into grazing pasture for cattle. So the evolution continues, unlikely to change, but only time will tell how that's all going to shake out. That's sort of where we are currently in terms of the agricultural support in that area and what the families are able to grow and grow profitably. Probably the biggest issue historically for the Frogville area was the relocation of the Indians. And we're going to talk in a minute about the Everidge and Oaks families, who were two of the largest, most prominent Indian families that settled in the Frogville area. And they not only had extended families with allotted land, but they had businesses and agricultural endeavors that allowed them to support extended family and to support a bigger impact there in the area. But those families were the primary families that moved into that area. They were governed by the chiefs and the governing council, who were located closer to Fort Towson. And it does not appear that there was ever actually a chief or anyone with tribal authority in the direct Frogville area, but it's also not clear that there wasn't. So those families still have relatives who live in the area, and some of them still own properties in the area. Some of their freedmen relatives still own property that they were allotted as part of the Choctaw allotments. So those people are still there. There was also an Indian mission in the area, the Goodwater, Michigan. Vic, try that again. Goodwater Mission, not the Goodland Mission. The Goodland Mission, of course, still operates with Presbyterians, but the Goodwater Mission was just outside of Frogville, and it was specifically designed for young Indian women. And the story goes that the young Indian women didn't really like being locked up at the Indian Mission, and some cowboys and bad guys came by, and the girls hopped on the back and left with them, and that was the end of the Goodwater Mission. Now, whether that story is true or not, I don't know, but that was the story growing up. And if you look at the book Smokestacks Over the Prairie, which was written by Frances Iman, a local journalist, she wrote two. She wrote, one's got a red cover and one's got a green cover. I think they're both out of print, but you can still find them online. And she did some research and took photos in the late 60s of the remnants of the Goodwater Mission. It's my understanding that that archaeological site is no longer really there. Property has changed hands a number of times, and there's been clearing and changing and this and that, so I'm not sure there's a lot left. But Frances did a nice job of describing that and talking about it in her book. So I'd highly recommend that you take a look at that if you're interested in it.
There's graves that are there still, graveyard.
Okay. Yeah.
That's about it.
If you're looking for research information on Frogville and its environs, as they call it, your best resources for that are really some of the Choctaw records, because they have some land records and they have some other records that are of use. You will also find the Oklahoma Indian Archives and the census rolls. The church records for the New Hope Presbyterian Church also still exist, and that's in the Presbyterian research materials, so if you are interested in that, you can find that as an original resource option. The cemetery transcriptions, the headstones are all still there. So there's the Oak Cemetery, which is on private property. You have to ask for access to that one. The Everidge Cemetery is also on private property. You can get access to both of those, but there are historic graves from the late part of the 1800s into the early part of the 20th century in both of those locations. So some headstones still exist, some do not. Many of the graves were unmarked, and particularly in the Oak Cemetery, there are a tremendous number of graves of small children who either died at birth or died shortly thereafter, because the health environment was not what one would hope, but there are a lot of small children graves in that particular cemetery. In terms of the Choate Springs Cemetery, that one was actually donated to the public by one of my great uncles and his wife. His wife was Eva Laura Everidge. She was a Choctaw Indian, and that was part of her allotment. And that cemetery was donated to the public by the two of them, Uncle Lum, Columbus, and his wife Eva. So that one is there. The Shoals Cemetery, also a historic cemetery, one of the cemeteries where a number of people who lived in Frogville are buried. That was the local church after the one at Frogville actually closed. So you can find information there. The Find a Grave website online, of course, has a lot of information that's easily accessible. But those are good resources. The county records here at the courthouse, most of them are not, the older ones are not digitized, but the records themselves are fascinating. It's a history book. If you have the abstract for your property, or if you know someone who has an abstract for their property, it's like reading a history book of the local history. So I recommend that you take a look at those and look at them closely, because it will give you sort of an ongoing history of what happened in this area, and it is probably the best contemporary explanation of what has happened with various land transactions. Like I said, Frogville School, it was still there, it was still operational, and then Oklahoma had a process in the late 40s into the early 50s of closing and consolidating those small schools. There's still a few around. They, by and large, closed most of those. I don't think there's still a 1 through 8 school in Choctaw County. I think there's at least one left in Curtin County, maybe 2, but there has been an ongoing effort to consolidate those. There are still some school records available in the Oklahoma Historical Society records, but they are not extensive. There's not a lot of information about it. Now, in terms of what you can find, these are the citations we've talked about on history and geography and looking at the records. But those are not the most interesting thing to do. The really interesting thing to do is to go and talk about the families. And I thought that having covered some of the history and some of the data, we could talk about some of the families. The Caldwell family that you see called out there, how many of you know Don Lohman? Bubba? His grandfather was Cooney Caldwell, and Cooney ran the store there at Frogville for many, many years. Very integral to the community there. Very deep roots, long roots. His wife was related to Omi Johnson. Omi was a Diffie. Her brothers, Wallace and Willie, owned property and ran businesses there in the Frogville area in the 30s and 40s. And in fact, Wallace went on to open the store in the Second Ward here in Hugo that ultimately was purchased by my Uncle TJ and run by his wife, Hen Opal, for many, many years. So long connections in commerce with all of that. The Oaks family, who I referenced, that was one of the Indian families, and the Oaks family still has extensive relatives here in the area. How many of you know Sean Robertson? Sean's mama was an Oaks. He's married to a girl who was a distant cousin of Oaks, but you know, we'll give him a pass on that. They were far enough related, it is not an issue. But the Oaks family, who is the namesake for the cemetery, also were family members for the Johnsons, because Laura Mae Johnson's mother was Ruby Oaks. So the families are connected. The Johnson family still owns extensive holdings in Frogville, and Larry and his son do some fairly interesting, very cutting-edge agricultural work. His son is a graduate of OSU and has a degree in agriculture, and his name's Lane. His wife is the current head of the USDA office here in Hugo. So lots of connections into Frogville. The Everidge family that we talked about just a little bit, they not only owned property and had allotted property, but Judge Everidge, and I always thought that meant that he was like an elected judge. Apparently it turns out that was just his first name. Judge Everidge in the 30s was the only one in Frogville who had very much money, and he also had a lot of connections. And he had the first telephone installed in Frogville. He had a line run from his property in Frogville across the river over to Pagoda, Texas, to the doctor. So if there was a problem and you needed a doctor, you could go to Judge Everidge, and call, and the doctor would take the ferry across, because there was a ferry that came from the Manchester-Pagoda area to just below the bluff in Frogville. And I think the name of the ferry was the Rock Ferry. I've spent the week trying to find somebody who could actually tell me the name. Heard Daddy talk about it a lot, unfortunately didn't write it down. But Reggie Smith and I are fairly convinced it was the Rock Ferry. But the ferry went back and forth from the North Texas side over to Frogville. And my Stevenson relatives, my grandmother was a Stevenson, she and her family moved from the Pagoda area to Frogville in 1904. She was 6 months old. And they came, it was so cold that winter that the river froze, and they drove across Red River on the ice. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but in my lifetime, I've never even seen the Red River icy, much less iced over. But that's how they got here. But the Stevenson family, who still lived in Pagoda, would hitch up their team, come across the ferry, and come over and visit and have Sunday dinner. So they came on a routine basis. Now, it is not clear to me that my relatives from Frogville ever did the same and went back to Pagoda, but that was the method of transportation back and forth. And they weren't the only ones. Lofton Brown, if any of you remember the Browns who owned property in Frogville, Lofton's family owned property both around Manchester in northern Texas, and they owned property in Frogville. And he took the ferry back and forth. And he was one of the first people in Frogville who owned a Model T, Model A, Model something pickup. He bought the pickup that was just the bed and the engine and steering wheel. And he rode on a bucket. And back in those days, they grew a lot of sweet potatoes. There was actually a sweet potato warehouse at Fort Towson. But Lofton, who was just a kid at the time, would pick up the sweet potatoes, take them to the railhead at Fallon, and put them on the train, and they would transport them. But he and his family were able to do that because they could take the ferry back and forth. There were a number of families that owned property on both sides of the river. In fact, the Johnson family owned property both in Frogville and on the other side of the river. And after Mr. Less, the elder, passed away and they built the bridge, LK still maintained that property in North Texas. The ferry was long since gone, but they would take tractors back and forth into North Texas and do work on their property there, work on their property in Frogville. Let's see, who else have I got out here? The Diffees I mentioned. Miss Diffie, my aunt, was actually married to Wallace for a while. My grandmother and Omi Johnson and Bertha Grant, who all lived right in the middle of Frogville, all lived there their entire lives. And they were all new brides at the same time. All three of them 13 years old. Now, that's something that has definitely changed in this world and changed for the better. But Miss Grant lived there. When I was a kid, she was a little bitty tiny thing. And I mainly remember her because she had the vocabulary of a sailor and she smoked little cigars. She was absolutely delightful. But she would sit on her front porch. She had a beautiful flower garden just north of the ice cream truck. So that property is no longer a house place. There's no one who lives there. But she lived there essentially all of her life, from the time she married at 13 until she died when she was in her late 70s. The Baggerleys, I'm sure many of you know Ray Noble and Kathleen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Kathleen was Baggerly, and she and her family lived in Frogville when they were very, very young. Her dad was known as the only Republican who lived in Frogville. That, of course, has also changed. But that family has long ties to the area as well. So there are a lot of good salacious stories about Frogville, but since we're being taped, I won't add any of those. But many of the families who live there still have lived there for a long time. the Frost side of my family moved to Frogville in roughly 1906. They moved just before statehood. My great-grandfather was a Sooner. He went across the line over close to Ellsworth, Oklahoma, and which apparently is now under lake. But they did really well. They were there for a year, and somebody ratted them out that he had snuck across the line. So they lost that particular piece of property and relocated to Frogville. Two of his sons married full-blood Choctaw women, and I have beautiful Choctaw cousins. But my grandfather married a Stevenson, and so we have the family history of having come back and forth on the ferry. But I appreciate your time and attention this evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope I've answered some of your questions about Frogville and piqued your interest enough that you go do some research on the rest of it.
Well, what's the story behind the name Frogville?
It depends on who you ask. The local story is that the frogs were so big that they could eat the ducks. I think that's probably hyperbole, but yeah, apparently it was swampland because it's there on the edge of the river. So it was named for having had so many frogs in the area.
And the story behind the milk truck?
The milk truck was bought to use to ferry stuff around by the Johnsons, because they owned that property there. And apparently it had a mechanical problem, and so they parked it, and it became history. It is now the local notation. You go to the milk truck and you either go north, south, east, or west. Yeah.
So is the milk truck and the ice cream truck, are they the same?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. It's a Borden's truck. Yeah. But it has been there for a bit.
Well, I saw another Borden's truck that was torn down like that, and I cannot remember where it's at. I thought, they do this a lot. Landmark.
It makes a good landmark. Yeah, everyone knows where the truck is. Yeah. Anything else?
That was very informative. I enjoyed it very much.
Good.
Thank you.
Very, very
Yeah.
good, yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yes. Well,
And my